Hallå, jag är Farya Faraji. Jag är i Islands huvudstad, Oslo. Jag älskar ABBA. Jag är redo att dö för ABBA. So far I've made 3 videos on the subject of Norse music. I always come back inevitably to the subject of the modern genre of music, which I call the Viking genre of music. And my position and the position of those bands themselves on this kind of music has always been very clear. It's that this kind of music was never meant to be historical reconstructions. It's funny because whenever I mention that, there's fanboys who get angry and they're like, oh, you're trying to delegitimize Einar Selvig's work and everything.
Your music is often described as Viking Age music, yet there are very few and vague sources describing the music of that time and age. How would you describe your music?
Definitely not as Viking Age music.
Heilung refer to their music as augmented history and etc. They themselves are the first to admit to that. And I say admit, but admit is not even the right word because you admit to a crime. They haven't committed a crime. What they're creating is historically themed music. Not that, by the way, they're ignorant. I'm sure that Einar Selvig knows everything there is to know about Old Norse music and everything. I'm sure these guys are literal experts on the subject. They're just willingly not going for a reconstruction. Now, in order to fully appreciate the difference between historically themed music and actual historical music and why they differ from one another, one has to understand how both are made, what dictates the creation of both. Historically themed music is based on the codes of the audience that it is meant for, the audience that it is contemporary with. Let me give you an example. In the Gladiator soundtrack, the duduk is featured prominently. Now, did Hans Zimmer feature the duduk because the duduk had a symbolic association with Rome, because it had a historical significance? None whatsoever. He used the duduk because he knew that to his primarily Western audience, the duduk has a vaguely ancient Eastern exotic sound. That's it. That's literally the only reason he used it, because it has associations to the audience, and those associations are not necessarily the actual historical associations that it has, because the duduk as an instrument is actually an Armenian instrument. It has a connotation historically and culturally of the Armenian highlands and the Caucasus. But nowadays in Western thought, it's perceived as this desert thing, as this ancient thing, as this even very much used now in Roman soundtracks ever since Gladiator. And so historically themed music is fundamentally ignorance-based. And I know it sounds bad, but it's true. Historically themed music is ignorance-based in the sense that it thrives on the ignorance of the audience. See, if the actual audience of Gladiator, if everybody knew that the duduk is Armenian, if the moment they heard a duduk, they would have gone, that's Armenian, that doesn't make any sense, he wouldn't have featured the duduk, because the audience does not have the knowledge of the actual historical basis and cultural basis of the duduk. They don't, it's permissible for Hans Zimmer to use it carte blanche without any problem. Another example would be the use of the piano in Game of Thrones Season 6's soundtrack. So Ramin Djawadi, in Game of Thrones Season 6, he wants to instill a sense of jarring discomfort to the audience at the beginning of a certain sequence. And he does that by using the piano. His logic being, pianos sound out of place in a medieval fantasy soundtrack setting, and so the usage of it will throw people off. And indeed, this was accurate on his part, because a lot of people in the audience, I remember in 2016, said, yeah, it was weird hearing a piano in a medieval fantasy setting. How weird.
OMG, I thought I was the only one that noticed. As soon as the piano played, I was so confused. Unfortunately, it threw me off for the rest of the scene. I kept thinking throughout, we're finishing 6 seasons of this show and now a piano is playing. Usually, the music seemed historical IY accurate for a fantasy show, and the piano is relatively a modern instrument.
I always found that to be very funny, because these people never complained about the cellos and the whole orchestral ensemble that he uses even in the opening theme as early as Season 1. All of these are just as modern as the piano. That is the foundational aspect of historically themed music and soundtracks. Soundtracks do not care whether or not something is true, they only care about how the audience feels. And how the audience feels is often random associations that have no basis in empirical data. It's what I call the Greek bagpipe effect. I'm often asked to compose Greek-themed music about ancient Greece for documentaries, video games, etc. And whenever I use bagpipes or the aulos, that are actual Greek instruments, I'm told, it's jarring. Why is that? Why is that jarring? It's Greek. Greeks do have bagpipes. Greeks do have the aulos. Yeah, but it sounds jarring. In the SPQR song, the only Roman instrument in that song is the aulos. And that's the one that people keep complaining about. People don't complain about the big blaring trumpet orchestra that did not exist in ancient Rome, that is completely modern. But they do complain about the only Roman instrument as being the part that is jarring. Audience expectations almost always run contrary to the actual reality of historical and cultural music. And historically themed music will always prioritize audience expectations over reality. The point of historically themed music is to give the audience what they want, to never make them feel jarred, to never go against their expectations, etc., etc. That's why you will almost never hear a bagpipe in a Hollywood soundtrack about ancient Greece, but you will hear all sorts of instruments that have nothing to do with actual modern or ancient Greece. Finally, the last part of historically themed music is also the importance of having music that sounds good to the audience. Our ideas of what sounds good are subjective. They change over time. So what sounds like good harmonies today is not the same thing as what sounded like good harmonies in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, people loved harmonies in parallel fifths, and nowadays classical musicians vomit whenever they hear parallel fifth harmony. So what sounds good or bad to us is inherently based on the cultural and historical context in which we live. And historical reconstructions are about giving you music as it would have sounded good for the people back then. It's equivalent to saying, I don't know, museums about ancient Roman artifacts are boring. I prefer Gladiator. Gladiator was better. So, yeah, it was better as entertainment. Nobody disputes that. I find museums to be pretty boring myself, but they have completely different intents, and you have to enjoy both for their respective intents. Unfortunately, we have been so inundated with historically themed music whose purpose is to prioritize what sounds good to a modern audience that a big chunk of modern people nowadays have lost the intellectual posture with which historical music should be approached. Historical music is not about whether it sounds good or bad to you or me. It's about how well it gives us an insight into what sounded good to people in the past. I should make a clarification here. I don't want to give you the impression that historical reconstructions of ancient music are a cold, emotionless approach. There is artistry involved, of course, and you are trying to be entertaining, but you're trying to be entertaining to an ancient audience, not to a modern one. So you will make decisions thinking, how can I make this sound as good as possible? But what sounds good should be dictated by the tastes of ancient people, not by the tastes of modern people. So for example, I recently re-uploaded my rendition of Stella Splendens. Now, a lot of people were put off by it and said, oh, this is an objectively bad performance. There are better performances out there. I don't like the vocals. The vocalists are bad. They're saying this because most versions of Stella Splendens use an anachronistic vocal style that is better suited for modern Western tastes. However, based on historical data, we can safely determine that to an Iberian ear of the 1300s, this kind of vocal style for their tastes was what they found to be a good way of singing. That's what they determine as that's what good singing is. That kind of microtonal inflection was described by a German priest back then as sounding angelic. That sounded angelic to their ears back then. Again, different association. Nowadays, we think of angelic as a boy choir going, oh, but again, associations change. And so that's the fundamental difference, again, between historically themed and historical music. If I'm doing historically themed music, I'm not going to use a bagpipe in my ancient Greek music because, oh no, I don't want to jar the modern audience because they think bagpipes sound Scottish and they're going to find it jarring. And I'm not going to use enharmonic modes because they use microtonal notes, and microtonal notes sound out of tune to most people's ears. But if I am doing historically informed performance, I'm thinking, what sounded good to the Greeks? Microtonality did. The bagpipe did. Very harsh reed instruments did. All of these sound bad to a modern mainstream audience, but fuck them. It's not about them. It's about giving an insight into the past. And there will always be, unfortunately, people who are very close-minded, who don't have the empathy to be able to think that tastes have changed over the years. And maybe if I have to approach historical music, I should approach it with their tastes rather than maintaining my own as some sort of objective universal truth. And this is ultimately what makes Wardruna, Heilung, Skald, and this entire Viking genre of music firmly rooted in the historically themed side. They will always prioritize not jarring their audience's associations and having good sounding music based on modern tastes, rather than providing any actual insight into what Norse music may have been like in the past. This genre of music features very prominently the toggle harpa and throat singing. Now, the toggle harpa is not a Scandinavian instrument. The Norse did not use it whatsoever. It is entirely a Finnish and Baltic instrument that is foreign to Scandinavian usage, at least geographically. And throat singing, as I've established many times before in the past, has no documented history in Scandinavia. It is utterly and completely foreign to Scandinavia. On the other hand, you have the Jorvik panpipe, an instrument that the Norse did have in the Viking Age, and yet it is almost never heard in this genre of music. So why is it that instruments and a vocal style that have nothing to do with the Norse have become the staples of this genre, have become literally the bulk of the sound of this genre, but an actual instrument that the Norse did use is almost never heard? The reason is simple. The Jorvik panpipe does not have acoustic properties that match audience expectations of what Norse music should sound like. It sounds too happy and too high-pitched and everything, and ignorance-based audience expectations demand a masculine, raw, powerful, dangerous, mystical, etc. kind of sound. And the Jorvik panpipe simply cannot satisfy those needs and simply cannot provide that. If Wardruna and Heilung and everything were about providing us with an actual insight into actual Norse music, they would be saying, you don't like the Jorvik panpipe, fuck you, that's what they used. No, we're not going to use the toggle harpa because they did not have the toggle harpa.
Historically themed will always prioritize the feelings of the audience, feelings rooted in ignorance, whereas actual historical music will always prioritize the empirical data over the feelings of the audience.
Now, you may think, after everything I've said, that I regard these bands like Wardruna and everything as nothing more than pure entertainment with a little more in terms of value. But that could not be further from the truth. I believe that there is actually a very profound anthropological richness to be found in that type of music if analyzed within a certain context. And that context for me is the always evolving image that we have of the Norse. See, cultures that historically have been focal points for other cultures across time. You can think of ancient Rome or ancient Greece, the Vikings, the Norse. There are certain cultures that will always be interesting, that will always be focused on by cultures in the future. These cultures at any given time will always have two versions. One, which is the culture as it existed actually in the past, as it actually was. And then the other one is going to be the culture as it is going to be remembered in the future based on the tropes and the desires and the fantasies of the contemporary era. And what's interesting for me is when you look at the Norse, you see that effectively our idea of the Norse keeps evolving over time. You look at how the Norse were represented in the 19th century in paintings, those romanticized romantic paintings, and in music with Wagner's operas. You realize that it's very distinct from how we portray them today. And interestingly enough, how those images of the Norse gods and mythology looks back then pretty much fits the music of Wagner. I'm not saying that one was based on the other or that, the music was composed to the images. I'm saying that they're both part of a cultural zeitgeist, the same zeitgeist. And then you move to today, you skip to today.
And what you see is another representation of the Norse, both visually and musically, that is completely distinct. I mean, it's supposed to be the same culture, and yet look at how they're represented in the 19th century and look at how they're represented today. And I think one of the key ingredients in how the Norse are represented today is that we have shifted from a far more European perception of the Norse as, a people within Europe, a people that, have a certain type of clothing and everything that's kind of, augmented with Leif Erikson's wings and everything. And you move to this sort of neo-shamanistic, neo-pagan kind of fantasy, shamanistic and spiritual and everything. Our conceptions have fundamentally changed, I think partially due to the fact that the main demographic that is dictating our view of the Norse today is in part people from a neo-pagan background, from a shamanistic background. These people are projecting what matters to them, how they would like the Norse to be in order to connect with them, and they're projecting it onto the Norse, therefore shaping the image of them. For me, that's the anthropological value of Wardruna, of Heilung, of these bands, and generally of that modern Viking aesthetic. The anthropological value of it for me is much the same as that of science fiction. See, science fiction is never about the future, really. Science fiction in the 80s is about the 80s. Science fiction that was made in the 70s was about the 70s. You look at War of the Worlds, the British novel. The original version of the novel made, in the 1800s, I think. Yeah, it was in the 1800s. It was, I believe, a sort of thinly veiled critique of how the European powers destroy more primitive, less advanced technological societies, the aliens obviously representing the British Empire. And then you look at War of the Worlds, the Steven Spielberg movie from 2005, and it's about September 11. Like, literally, I mean, it's very clear. They've made it clear themselves. The metaphors in the movie are very clear. It is very much about the anxieties of America after the attacks of September 11, this idea that we thought we were the most powerful, and now we realize that at any moment we can be vulnerable to these horrific attacks. And so in 200 years, I guarantee you, we will have another aesthetic to represent the Norse. The Norse will be represented in a completely different light, and their music will sound different. You will always have the Norse as they actually were in history, and over time you will always have different versions of the Norse in pop culture that somewhat overlap with how they actually were in history, but are ultimately more about what that contemporary society is. And that's where I think the fanboys who listen to Wardruna and Heilung thinking that they're listening to historical recreations, that's what they're getting wrong. Wardruna is a powerful tool to understand who we are. Their music is about who we are today. It's about Neopaganism today, it's about Europe today, it's about Europe's idea of itself today. But it has almost nothing to do with the past. It is, however, a very strong mirror and reflection of ourselves now. Initially, I was taken aback by the intensity of the anger with which some fans of these bands responded when I showed that, based on empirical evidence and scientific methodology, there's absolutely no proof that the Norse had throat singing, nor is there any reason to entertain the idea beyond trying to retroactively legitimize a fantasy induced by pop culture and by those bands. And these videos have been met by a minority of people with the type of anger that is usually reserved for matters of ethnic belonging, of nationalism, matters that deal with the deepest parts of people's identities, cultural identities. And well, little did I know that there are actually people out there who... There are actually people who have deluded themselves into believing that throat singing is a part of their ethnic heritage, of their cultural and spiritual heritage. Again, these are the people who took Wardruna and everything at face value and now believe it to be an actual representation of Norse Scandinavian music. And so you actually have some people, especially those of a heathen and pagan, neo-pagan, Wiccan sort of background, who listen to this type of music not only as entertainment, but as an actual expression of their spiritual and cultural identity. Their experience with those bands is very much adjacent to that of Catholics listening to Mass, or to Orthodox Greeks listening to Byzantine chant. Heathens actually pointed out to me, they're like, yeah, there's a subgroup within our communities who are kind of, who actually think this to be reconstructed music, whereas they haven't understood that what Einar Selvik and everything did, and I believe Einar Selvik might himself be a neo-pagan heathen, something along those lines, I'm not sure exactly what, but what they did not understand is that Einar Selvik himself was actually creating a new sound for a new religious movement out of different disparate historical elements, which I think is a very noble goal. But a lot of people have not understood that. Part of the logic behind the creation of this new aesthetic was a rejection of all things Christian. So there was a voluntary and perhaps on some level subconscious desire to fundamentally reject all that seems Christian, to create an aesthetic that is as far removed from traditional Christianity as possible. This is why they went for what seemed to them like the most unchristian things, like throat singing, shamanistic elements from Native American music, Siberian music. I think there's this expectation that pre-Christianization Norse Scandinavia would have been fundamentally different on every level, that all the music would have been alien and shamanistic, and that they would have always had these weird antlers and feathers on their heads and would have dressed in the most fantastical of ways. The aesthetic cultivated by this whole primitivism movement and everything of Europe, of neopagans and heathens and everything, would suggest that pre-Christianization Europe was a land more similar to the Siberian nomads and the Native Americans, and that Christianization was a cultural transformative force so powerful that it literally modified everything down to the last detail. And we simply see that not to be true, because the history of Christianization is one of syncretism. Christianity is far more pagan than we tend to believe. This primitivism movement would suggest an idea wherein Christianity fundamentally changed every single possible aspects of these ancient European cultures, down to their rituals, down to their music, down to their clothing and everything. But when you look at the Norse of pre-Christianization Scandinavia, they dressed much the same as post-Christianization. They didn't really dress differently. They weren't wearing fucking weird fantasy new age antler outfits like this. And then suddenly they started dressing like Northern Europeans as Christianity came. They already looked like generic fucking Northern Europeans. I'm always going to push for that. The Norse were generic as fuck Northern Europeans with the most generic, predictable sort of... You look at their armors and clothing, you're like, that's exactly what I would expect from the early Middle Ages in Europe. For some strange reason, we've developed this idea that paganism equals convulsing on the ground and having your eyes go up your sockets. Paganism equals bathing in the blood of an animal. Paganism equals weird vocal textures and putting an antler and going like this and doing weird movements like that. And yet, as I've always pointed out, this is paganism. The architecture of the Vatican is the architecture of Greco-Roman antiquity, which was a pagan civilization. When you hear Orthodox choirs singing, or the Gregorian chant as it was in the early Middle Ages, you don't think paganism, and yet those are the products of the music theory that goes directly back to ancient Greek music. My point is, there is no meaningful distinction between paganism and Abrahamic religions on an anthropological level. Theologically, sure, there is. But on an anthropological level, what pertains to the daily rituals, the sound of the music, the way that the rituals are performed, there is no meaningful distinction between the two. See, this intellectual posture wherein Christianity and the Abrahamic religions are one thing, and then everything else just gets thrown under the same umbrella of paganism, that is a Christian-centric perspective. Anthropologically, there is no such thing as Abrahamic religions and then everything else is paganism. That is an arbitrary division that the Abrahamic religions came up with in the first place. It's Christianity that in the first place came up with the idea that we are special, we are the one true religion, and then everything else is, it's all pagan, it's all heathen, it's all the same, it's all... And then what's very funny is, I talked to some of those heathens who really want throat singing and everything to be true, and I ask them, okay, You guys are obsessed with the idea of not letting Christianity contaminate your paganism. It's very, very important for them that they maintain the purity of their paganism as it was before Christianization came in and polluted the entire thing. I'm like, okay, sure. So then why do you start imitating Mongolian shamanism and Siberian shamanism and Native American practices? If the point is to be as purely Scandinavian as possible, readily accepting Mongolian shamanism and everything. And they say, well, it's different. It's different. Christianity is Abrahamic, but Mongolian shamanism and Native Americans, it's all paganism. It's part of the same category as our beliefs. It's part of the same. They're literally espousing that idea that Christians came up with in the first place. They themselves are putting everything outside of Christianity in the same box of it's all paganism, whatever, and happily embracing it. It cannot be put into words how fundamentally shaped by Christianity these new forms of paganism are. And again, I want to make this very clear because heathens and pagans in modern day and age are some of the most knowledgeable, some of the kindest, some of the most intelligent people that I've met. The majority of them are acutely aware that they are not reproducing and resurrecting ancient paganism. They are acutely aware that what they are engaging in is a modern spiritual movement that was created in the modern day and age and answers to modern codes and modern ideas. And that is perfectly fine. For the heathens and the pagans, however, who like to come at me and say that, no, this is how it was done. I'm doing exactly what my ancestors did. You're not. You're cosplaying as an ancient pagan. You're cosplaying as your stereotypical idea of what you think an ancient European pagan was. I think what makes a lot of people uncomfortable, and they really want to deny that, is that at the end of the day, Norse religious singing to Odin and Freya and everything most probably sounded more like this than it did this.
To put it simply, Neopagan bands like Heilung start using throat singing, copying them directly from Siberian and Mongolian traditions because it fit their artistic expression. Perfectly valid. But a portion of their Neopagan and heathen fans really want their paganism to be the same as ancient paganism and not a modern construct. And so they engage in historical revisionism to claim pre-Christian Europe always had throat singing. I don't have a problem with the Heilung aesthetic as an artistic aesthetic. In fact, I love it. I have a problem with the fact that millions now believe it to be a reenactment of real pre-Christian Europe, a bullshit myth of an idealized, old Europe, where everyone was a Native American Siberian shaman throat singing all day long. This is little more than the wet dream of some deluded neopagans yearning for a past that is a projection of what their modern paganism is. I would love Middle-earth to actually have been prehistoric Europe, the way Tolkien made it in the lore. But I won't do mental gymnastics to delude myself into thinking it. Gondor isn't real. Let's all grow the fuck up.
I feel vindicated. I'm a Norse heathen, but Wardruna and Heilung are just not my groove. And I get some weird looks from my fellow heathens when I say so. Folk music on simple traditional instruments is perfectly lovely. The heavy metal warrior fantasy has its place, and gives people a lot of joy. But if I really want to travel back in time and evoke a vibe of days long past, they miss the mark for me.
As a revivalist, revisionist heathen, I think it's pretty important to note that while a lot of stuff obviously wasn't around in that period, heathenry is a revivalist faith, so modern heathen singing a la Wardruna have their place. As a note, I use Wardruna here because they are neopagans and heathens. It's creating a new sound for a revived and revised faith. Though certainly it shouldn't be used excessively in my faith's music, and further to the point, we should acknowledge in instances where it is used that particular technique is drawn from another culture to help rebuild ours.
There is an ultimate irony in all of that, because I am often accused by vulnerable sort of far right-winger sort of white nationalist movement types of hating white people. You hate white people and everything, because I've pointed out, for example, that in the 19th century, Western Europe very much sort of culturally colonized Greece and tried to, completely sort of separated from its Eastern roots. And you're like, well, you're a Middle Easterner, you're biased. Of course you would say that, even though my arguments are literally, well, the Greeks are close to the Middle East too, so they will always have natural affinities with their, supposedly that makes me hate white people. And every time I talk about throat singing and how, no, throat singing is not a thing that white people in Scandinavia have ever had, you have some of those neo-pagan, there is a dark undercurrent of sort of neo-Nazism and everything, and a lot of those heathen movements. A lot of heathens themselves have told me this, so this is not me pulling it out of my ass, it's very much something that I've been told. And the funny thing is, they claim a sort of pride in their ancestry, and yet their idea of their ancestry is something that is co-opted from exotic lands. Whereas my position, when looking at the empirical data of historical music in Scandinavia, is that there is a great deal of cultural richness to be found in Scandinavia in terms of music that does not require the co-opting of Mongolian and Siberian throat singing. My message to Scandinavians is, you people have a wonderful, rich historical musical tradition that you should be proud of, and be proud of that. You don't need to go and co-opt throat singing and retroactively pretend that you've had that all the time.
It's a bit frustrating that the throat singing myth is completely overshadowing the cool stuff that we do have. Like the kulok, kulning, and stuff. Which is stuff I think the Vikings were 100 times more likely to have, because at least we have evidence of that stuff being present in Scandinavia, lol.
Why are these not at the forefront of this supposedly Norse form of music? But yeah, the funny thing is, I supposedly hate Scandinavians and white people, and I'm the one who's like, you guys are white Europeans, and so you should be represented as white Europeans, aka why the fuck would there be Mongolian and Siberian throat singing? Because the funny thing is, when you have a black woman playing the Queen of Sweden in the new Viking series, people get upset, as I did. I don't want to see people who look like me in a Viking series, unless they're, I don't know, like Greek, Eastern Roman, or Arabic merchants or whatever. But my Björns and my Karls and whatever is my Scandinavian characters, I want them blonde and fucking blue-eyed. We agree on this, but the moment then I say the music should be that of Scandinavians, aka why the fuck should there be Siberian and Native American elements in it, then suddenly we disagree on that. It's kind of hypocritical. I'm just being consistent here. Alright, so now I want to move to the part of the video where I read comments, some of them interesting, some of them, well, interesting because they're intelligently written, some of them interesting because they're less intelligently written, and we're going to deconstruct those comments, comment on them, and, it should be fun. So welcome to the second part of the video.
A big thank you. I'm Saxon Viking plus Iranian, and all this bravado about dreary music, or music, heavy metal Viking.it needs to be thrown out, and for people to get realistic, stop selling TV series and games.
I couldn't possibly disagree more with this sentiment, and it is absolutely antithetical to the views that I espouse in all of my videos. Unfortunately, on both sides of the spectrum, both the angry fanboys of those bands and the historical purists, both of them seem to often interpret my videos as being condemnations of that type of music. It's not historical, therefore it's bad. Never have I ever once uttered a sentiment that is even remotely adjacent to that idea. I've always clarified that it's perfectly okay to enjoy this kind of music, and this kind of music has its own value. That value is simply not historical. Because to me, these kind of people, the historical purists who look at any historical movie and they point out historical inaccuracies and say, therefore the movie is bad. Because it's one thing to say, oh, Gladiator, it has a lot of inaccuracies, but you can still enjoy it for that reason. That's an intelligent way to approach the movie. But people who say, hey, Gladiator has historical inaccuracies, therefore the movie is bad as a movie, those people are people of very low intelligence, in my opinion. I think historical purists who think that anything that is not perfectly accurate is automatically bad are just as unintelligent as people who would say this is not actual Norse singing because there's no throat singing. You know, in my Palestina lead music video, you have my friend Etienne representing a crusader, and then he's fighting against the Saracen in this highly romanticized sort of video with the shadows and everything, and they're doing these poses in slow motion. And I had a few comments of people going, that's inaccurate. The crusades were in one-on-one duels between two people, and that's not how they would fight. They're not holding the swords correctly. They would not swing that high. They think they're so intelligent. Actually intelligent people understand that, bro, this is supposed to be like an allegorical, poetic representation of the Crusades. Obviously, this is not supposed to be like an accurate depiction of a battle. You have one guy representing Christendom, the other guy representing Islam, and they're doing these poses because they look nice and they hearken to ancient paintings and everything. I mean, intelligence, what makes us human, is the ability to understand things on a more abstract level. Abstract thought is one of the things that confers to us our sort of unique human intelligence. Gathering of the Birds by Omar Khayyam. It's this Persian poem where the birds gather in a council and talk. And I had somebody say, that's stupid, birds don't talk, it doesn't make any sense. And it's like, the fact that they think they're being intelligent, I'm intelligent because I know birds don't talk. There's this thing about art where in art, truth is not always the same as reality. Let me explain. Suppose that you want to make a movie about Julius Caesar, and the goal of your movie is to show Caesar's personality. The goal of your movie is to give the most accurate assessment of Caesar's personality. Not his life, not the events, his personality. Now imagine if in that 2-hour movie, you really want to show the part where he gets kidnapped by pirates and he has fun with them and he's super charismatic and he's like, haha, I'm going to crucify you motherfuckers. And then when he's free, he actually does crucify them. What this says about Caesar's personality is absolute gold, and you want that in your movie. The problem is you only have 2 hours and you have to begin your movie during the invasion of Gaul, basically. You can't go through his childhood and his younger years and everything. And so you're stuck in a conundrum. You want to show that aspect of his personality. You want that truth about his personality to be communicated in the movie, but you can't have that anecdote. So what you do is, in the script, you replace that anecdote with a new one that is set in Gaul. And so an anecdote similar to this happens during the War of the Gauls, and instead of pirates, he's kidnapped by Gaulish warriors, and he laughs at them, and maybe he crucifies them, whatever. So, of course, it is not real. It is less real because that did not happen. However, in constructing a fictional event based on a real one, what you manage to do in that movie is to capture that essential aspect of Caesar's personality, that ruthlessness, that charisma and everything. Had you not included that in the movie through deliberate inaccuracy that allows you to include that anecdote in a movie, in a sense, the movie would be less truthful to Caesar's personality. A fundamental anecdote that tells you something about the fundamentals of Caesar's personality would be lost. Truth is not always the same as reality in art, and sometimes art, through deliberate manipulation of reality, can be more truthful. That's the whole thing about Impressionism as a painting. Impressionism is in a way more truthful. It may be less real, but it's more truthful because it shows you reality not as it was, but as the artists felt it. It is more truthful to their feelings rather than to the actual objective reality that their eyes were giving them, right? And just on a more surface level, I mean, if we were to create a society where we made it taboo to ever have fun with history and to go for historical inaccuracies, I think that would absolutely suck. I mean, Rise, Son of Rome. I love the design of the Romans in that game. I love how they look. I love their armor. I think it would suck if we didn't have it.
Those bands' style of music is a celebration, not recreation of the culture's music that inspired them.
No, that's very well said, and I absolutely agree with that statement. It celebrates those cultures without recreating the music from those cultures, and that I think is something that is completely valid. If you make music about a certain civilization, it doesn't have to be reconstructed music.
Sana mi tompati se muharu to podari
Wardruna makes me feel I'm Viking.
That's well said, and again, I think that's the point of Wardruna, is to make you feel things, and it functions on a instinctive, primal level, not on an intellectual level of knowledge of empirical data. You want to make a modern person feel like a Viking, you have to use sounds that they have codified with associations of that which sounds Viking to them, which may not necessarily be things that would actually have sounded like Norse music. It's literally how you end up with throat singing in these bands in the first place. A lot of fanboys from these bands desperately try to, interpret it as if, no, there's like some really clever historical data behind it. It's literally because they heard throat singing and they were like, yo, it sounds masculine and badass and warrior-like. Like literally a superficial impression. It just sounds like that. And Vikings are masculine and warrior, and so it works. And again, throat singing in those cultures, the actual cultures that they were borrowed from, in those cultures, throat singing doesn't have any specifically masculine, warrior-like, barbaric kind of associations. And so the presence of throat singing in the music of those bands not only has nothing to do with the actual function of throat singing in actual societies that have them, it has everything to do with the superficial impression that foreigners, in this case Westerners, had of them.
I think the modern Viking folk genre is like a spiritual successor to the Norwegian black metal scene. You start with edgelord middle-class teenagers looking for something pagan and primal to shock society, and a few decades later you've got very serious throat-singing white dudes with mullets, playing music that also has a clear yearning to convey something primal and alien. You hit the nail on the head pointing out that a lot of these groups aren't trying to be historical, more than a few are very open about that. They're not going for a reconstruction so much as a feeling or an artistic idea, but even those are still ideas that are very colored in by familiar medieval tropes.
Not only a spiritual successor, an actual successor offspring. Wardruna's Selvik and Garl were both in Gorgoroth, and countless Nordic folk artists overlap with black metal.
It is clearly an artistic expression of a romanticized view of the savage people. The image of the noble savage always works in pop culture.
We may know that they're going for an artistic play on Viking pagan tropes, but my experience with fans of this genre is that it's being taken as literal historical representation of the culture and music. It's cashing in on the average Joe who just got done binge watching Vikings on Netflix and now wants to channel their inner Ragnar. That's so true, especially among nerds, video game nerds, fantasy nerds, anime nerds, etc. They don't care about history or culture, they only care about things that a child would find badass. I'm into Harold Foss. Do you think it's closer to historical Viking music?
Whilst Wardruna on a spectrum of reality to fantasy is like completely on the fantastical side, Wardruna is as related to real history as The Witcher's universe is historical. Harold Foss's music is folk music. It's Scandinavian folk music of today. My idea is you take modern Scandinavian folk songs and you remove the harmony and you play them with ancient Norse instruments, and that's probably the closest approximation that you can get. And some people pushed back on that in the last videos. They said, well, music changes over time. Nobody's saying it's the same thing, right? Of course, Scandinavian folk music of today is distinct from the music of the Viking Age, but that is a monstrous false equivalence, because Scandinavian folk music is an actual real form of ethnic music that actually exists in the world, that is in a direct historical line with Old Norse music. Whatever that was, we know that modern Scandinavian folk music is in a direct line of continuity with that older style of music. Whereas on the other hand, Wardruna and Heilung are modern, made-up sounds where they put together Mongolian and Tuvan influences and Native American influences on the basis of what sounds cool to them, on the basis of their modern associations. So to imply that the two of them are as distantly related, are equally as distantly related to Old Norse music, is an idiotic false equivalence. Of course, modern Scandinavian folk music, compared to Wardruna and Heilung, is going to be closer to whatever Old Norse music was.
Possibly one of the dumbest comments that I've ever read on my channel was somebody who commented on my first Norse video by saying, well, you know, you're talking about Wardruna making historically themed music that is not really historical, that has nothing to do with real ethnoculture, but that's the same thing with your music. I mean, your epic Iranian music, modern Iranian music isn't actual Sasanian music. That is a common tactic that a lot of people employ whenever I speak of these
the bands and everything, which is to draw a comparison wherein they're both historically themed music, and therefore your representation of Scandinavian or whatever music is not fundamentally different from theirs. The problem, though, is there's a spectrum of historically themed music and how to approach it. Yes, I've always been very open about the fact that my epic Iranian music is just modern Iranian music of the dastgah and modern folk music systems, but it is an actual form of music that actually exists today. Wardruna and Heilung's music is so fantastical that the only proper analogy I can think for it is the Dune soundtrack by Hans Zimmer. And you have to understand my admiration for Wardruna and Heilung. These people have created a new form of music, an entire genre, an entire ethnic sound that never existed before. What they have achieved is the equivalent of what Tolkien achieved when he made up the Quenya and Sindarin languages. That is an achievement of such colossal proportions, and to insult them and lower their effort by comparing it to me when all I'm doing is just copy-pasting actual ethnic music. Who I can be compared to is Harold Foss. It's the Skaldic Bard. It's Arani Zoltan. It's Peter Pringle. Those are the people I can be compared to, because all those sort of musicians just used actual folk music of a certain land, remain authentic to it as it is today, and just use it to thematically refer to ancient cultures that inhabited those lands in the past. If I start to incorporate Inuit throat singing with Aztec dances in my epic Byzantine music, then maybe we can have a comparison. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying you have to understand the difference between those two. And that comment to me strikes me as the ultimate representation of somebody who has a complete inability to know what they are listening to.
The overall point here is that the moment most people understand the distinction between actual historical music and historically themed music, they then put all historically themed music in a basket without distinction. Historically themed music exists on its own spectrum. Wardruna is relatively more authentic to Norse music due to using Norse instruments and Norse lyrics, along with non-Norse instruments, compared to Wagner's operas, despite both sharing the same Norse theme. Similarly, while Peter Pringle's Gilgamesh songs aren't remotely reconstructed ancient Mesopotamian music, they are absolutely modern Middle Eastern music. I would absolutely use his Gilgamesh opening as an example of authentic modern Middle Eastern music in an ethnomusicology class. So could my song Digenis and Death be used as a typical example of Cretan music in such a class? The Wardruna Heilung genre, by virtue of being driven by avant-garde creativity and pure originality, cannot be considered authentic to anything. It is on the opposite far end of the historically themed spectrum where lies the fantasy side, like A Song of Ice and Fire's Westeros universe. I would be interested to learn if you have listened to Wardruna's, or, more precisely, Einor's, album, Skald. While he has stated that Wardruna is a modern interpretation of old spirituality, I feel like that album specifically does try to capture the skaldic traditions of the Old Norse.
So I love that question because it touches upon something that I think is very, very important, which is that a lot of people think that historically accurate music is anything that isn't heightened or orchestral. I remember somebody said the Assassin's Creed Origins soundtrack was authentic, but it didn't sort of, work for me. And my reaction was, the Assassin's Creed Origins soundtrack isn't authentic at all whatsoever. Like, the Assassin's Creed Origins soundtrack has literally nothing to do with ancient Egyptian music. AC Odyssey soundtrack actually is possibly the only application of actual ancient Greek music within its soundtrack that I know of. It actually uses ancient Greek sounds and instruments. It's the only case that I know of. But AC Origins, the soundtrack, is not authentic. But just because it's not like a generic orchestral sound, the person just assumed that, well, therefore it has to be authentic. It's not the case. So when it comes to the Skald album, because it has like a stripped down acoustic kind of sound that's only on the lyre, people think, well, therefore that must be authentic. No, it superficially may seem like it's authentic, but it's still not. Because, for example, Voluspo, which is my favorite song on the soundtrack, he's using arpeggiated chords and everything. So he's using a chord progression, he's using arpeggiated chords. He is basically playing the song exactly as modern rock ballads are played. Like, the Scald album, it literally works like an Ed Sheeran album works. It uses the same kind of code. You could have changed it with an acoustic guitar and you would get an Ed Sheeran sound, basically. And this is why an understanding of music theory is important, because often people rely on superficial ideas. Well, superficially it sounds like it's authentic just because it's stripped down, but that's just a veneer, that's a facade. If you understand music theory, you can see beyond just the superficial veneer of, well, it sounds more stripped down. And I think this is something that's important, because to a lot of people, they're like, I want medieval music that's authentic, and then they listen to those like 8 hours of medieval tavern music on YouTube, and they're not at all medieval music. They have chords, they're written like modern rock songs, but they're only played on older instruments, often those digital VSTs, and so they superficially seem, it's again the Game of Thrones piano thing. People complain that there was a piano, but they don't complain about the cellos and the rest of the orchestra. And like, both of them are from the same period. Both of them are not medieval. It's just that they recognize the piano as not being medieval, but the other one. So there's a lot of superficial understanding, I think. And so in this case, it's a very good question, but you know, that's why an understanding of music theory is paramount. I remember I did this, this video on Greek music, and I was like, ancient Greek music continues into the Byzantine tradition, and the Byzantine tradition is fundamentally different from the music that would evolve in Western Europe. And then some fucking moron was like, well, you know, that Cretan song that you played... It sounds just like a medieval song, so how can you claim that it's different from Western European music? And I'm like, it doesn't sound like a medieval song. If you know nothing about music theory, you might just think, well, it sounds ancient and medieval. Sure, but if you actually listen to what's going on, you have a highly heterophonic arrangement that is accompanied by a power chord progression. There were no power chord progressions in medieval Europe, the way there are in Cretan music today. The problem is, if you don't know what power chord progressions are, if you don't know basic music theory, you might listen to this and you probably won't have much of an idea. You probably won't be able to tell, like, how does that differ fundamentally from medieval music? This is why you need an understanding of music theory. Once you do know, it's blatant that it's different. But if you want to know more about music theory, you know, the totality of my videos will give you a good grasp and basis. And once you know what a chord progression is, and you can recognize the, harmony and chord progressions, and you hear a supposedly Norse piece of music that uses harmonic progressions and modern chords and everything, then you'll know that it's not authentic. So the Scald album is superficially more authentic sounding, but it's not actually more authentic sounding.
I do Viking reenactment, and it's kind of shocking how common the Viking throat singing stuff is in the community. It's just kind of funny that the same people that spend months researching Norse dyes to authentically reproduce a fabric and hand-stitch a shirt based on a grave-find fragment and period illustrations will also do Vikings throat singing and not question it.
There's this great point that's repeatedly made by Jackson Crawford in his videos, that we are obsessed with material historical accuracy, and we care far less relatively about other forms of historical accuracy. So imagine that you were to give a Mongolian sword or Chinese armor to a Viking in one of those TV series, in the Northman or in the Viking TV series. Everybody would lose their shit. Metatron would be making videos about it and everything, and as they should. I'm not criticizing this. All the fanboys on Reddit would be like, this is inaccurate, this is ridiculous, why are they wearing Chinese or Mongolian armor? But then you give them a form of music, throat singing, from virtually the same distance geographically, and the same fanboys will die on the hill that there's nothing wrong with it. So we indeed do care far more about material historical accuracy, simply because I think it's much more obviously visible to us, whereas when it comes to music, again, you'd have to know music theory, you'd have to know the basics of ethnomusicology. It's not as obvious to us, and so it gets a pass, basically. So as I was making the video, I was traveling through Sweden, and I was in the medieval town of Visby, and I was in the museum of the town of Visby. There were a bunch of medieval reenactors there, And this is what I heard from these medieval reenactors at the Museum of Visby.
I do Viking reenactments, and it's kind of shocking how common the Viking throat singing stuff is in the community. It's being taken as literal historical representation of the culture and music.
For anybody at this point who wants to tell me that, oh, come on, nobody listens to Wardruna for historical accuracy, everybody knows it's not real. I've been in Sweden, in Scandinavia, for 3 days. 3 days. And I've heard throat singing here. I'm expecting to hear throat singing after 3 days in Mongolia, in the Altai, yes. Not in fucking Scandinavia. Not in a museum with people doing medieval reenactment.
There's a lot of "my ancestors did that too" rewriting of history for the purpose of cultural appropriation, when it's perfectly okay to just borrow things and admit to borrowing it.
Yeah, so I'm happy somebody brought that up because cultural appropriation is a real issue here. Now, please calm the fuck down if you're about to go crazy on me. Like, cultural appropriation doesn't exist. Here's the thing. Unfortunately, it's a term that's been politicized, and there's a lot of extremism attached to it. On one hand, you have the radical leftist woke idiots who call literally everything cultural appropriation. They have no idea what they're talking about. Just point their fingers, that's cultural appropriation, this is cultural, everything is cultural appropriation. And then on the other hand, you have right-wing morons who will say that cultural appropriation just doesn't exist, it's not a thing. For those of them who say cultural appropriation is not a thing, yeah, how about the Netflix Cleopatra show, where, Afrocentrists claim that Cleopatra was black. So the issue is not whether or not cultural appropriation exists or not, it's being able to identify with a sort of rational mind what it is, instead of just applying it haphazardly, the term, in a universal manner, the way that I think the radical left has done a little too liberally, if you will. Now, here's my position on cultural appropriation when it comes to throat singing for Wardruna and everything. They have every right to use those vocal techniques. At the end of the day, those vocal techniques are part of the patrimoine, as we say in French, of humanity. I don't think humans need the permission of other humans from other cultures to use aspects of their culture. I think that's fucking stupid. They have every right to use throat singing in their compositions to aid their aesthetic purposes and goals. I do not think that makes them guilty of cultural appropriation, with the caveat that they should credit the original cultures in the first place. They should mention, hey, by the way, we've taken this from Mongolian inspiration, from Tuvan inspiration, from Siberian inspiration. As long as they do that, I think that's perfectly fine. The problem arises when people start rewriting history to claim that, no, they didn't take that from Siberia. It's always been in Scandinavia. And that's the problem. You have angry people, Scandinavians or Americans who have like 1/4 of Scandinavian ancestry, or fucking neo-Nazi weirdos or whatever, like a bunch of those people who basically come in and they say, no, this throat singing is traditional to us and we've always had it. That's the textbook definition of cultural appropriation. When people start to claim that it's always been a part of the legacy of those lands, which those bands have never done, so they are not guilty of cultural appropriation, but they have set in motion an unfortunate set of events that has effectively resulted in an unfortunate unwanted secondary effect of cultural appropriation that has happened by proxy of pop culture doing this, basically. In my throat singing debunking video, where I talk about horn helmets. Nowadays, everybody hates horn helmets. You can't have horn helmets in a Viking film. If you see something that has a horn helmet, you go, that's inaccurate. And I remember the Northman, which sort of touted itself as being a more historically accurate representation of the Norse, and it really was. Credit has to be given to the director. They are into historical authenticity, but they still had the whole Wardruna soundtrack thing and everything, and they had the throat singing. They're not above the reflexes of modern pop culture either. But one interesting thing is they had a horn helmet during in the trailer, I remember. But they have a horn helmet. I remember when the trailer came out, everybody was like, inaccurate, horn helmets are inaccurate, it's a myth. And the funny thing is, the reason they added a horn helmet in the movie is because we have discovered the Oseberg tapestries, and in the Oseberg tapestries, we can see something that pretty much resembles a horn helmet, which may lend credence to the idea that the Norse may have used horn helmets, obviously not as helmets for battle, but rather for rituals. Now, the funny thing is, we actually have physical evidence of horn helmets, visual depictions of horn helmets for the Scandinavians, and yet most people will still reject it by saying it's a myth, but those same people will happily accept throat singing as a theory and a possibility for the Norse. That fundamental hypocrisy highlights how often what we are ready to entertain as possible and what we reject as myths often has to do more with what is currently fashionable in pop culture rather than anything based in empirical data. Horn helmets just aren't fashionable in pop culture nowadays, but throat singing is so central to an entire genre of music with financial backing and everything that people need to go through all sorts of mental gymnastics in order to maintain its legitimacy in the popular mind, even though ultimately between horn helmets and throat singing, horn helmets are actually more probable right now given the empirical data. And yet everybody rejects horn helmets as the funny myth, but throat singing is fine, and I'm wrong for pointing it. I've said it before and I'll say it again. The 19th century had horn helmets. We have throat singing. Throat singing is our horn helmets of today. We are no fucking better than the 19th century and their operatic Wagnerian depictions of the Vikings and the Norse. We don't get to laugh at them and mock them for that because we're doing the exact same today, just with a different aesthetic.
How prevalent were jaw harps in medieval Scandinavia? I am asking specifically, excuse the ignorance, but it is an instrument I primarily associate with the Siberian and Turkic cultural sphere. I am aware that it is also found else, though Siberians advertise it nowadays the most as cultural object. How prevalent is it in modern Scandinavian music outside of Sami music? The reason why I am asking is because it seems to me that there is a certain trend of shamanization of the Norse, both the imagery as well as the music. You already talked about throat singing and how we envision their religion and other things. We conjure up this picture that is best described as shamanic. Now, I don't want to say there were no shamanistic elements in their culture, among other things because the Sami are their direct neighbors, though the term shamanism itself is often a much too broad category to solely describe the religions of northern Eurasia as a whole. It might be better to say their culture included shamans, shaman itself being a rather broad term, with the only major distinction being that a shaman is not a priest, whatever that may mean, rather than their religion being shamanism.
I want to comment here because I absolutely adore this point. It really drives home the point I was making earlier in the video about how we have a conceptualization that is very Abrahamic-centric in nature, wherein Islam, Judaism, Christianity, they're one category, and then everything else is in another category. And we just expect that if the Norse did that, then we can expect the Mongolians did that because, it's all the same, it's all paganism anyway. And all paganism, all animism is basically just the same thing. And similarly, we apply the term shamanism effectively to any member of the clergy or any spiritual figure, any person who fulfills a priestly role in a society outside of the classic Abrahamic religions. And to me, there is a certain madness in calling an African figure like that, an Inuit figure like that, a Mongolian, a Siberian figure like that, and we just all call them shamans. They're all shamans, whatever, it's all shamanism anyway. There's a certain absurdity to that. The distinction between an African spiritual figure, a Mongolian one, an Inuit one, they are all as distinct from one another as a priest is distinct from a rabbi, and yet we don't conceptualize it this way, as the commenter pointed out.
Anyway, regarding the Norse, my impression is that we take what seems most pagan and ancient to us within the modern world, in these cases what we know from Siberian religions of the last 2 centuries, and project this into the deeper past. So too do we take the Norse and project onto them our image of what is ancient and pagan, and currently what is pagan is most often orientated towards shamanism. Likewise, we could take the religions of the Romans or ancient Hindus as inspiration for what we imagine the Norse to have been like, but we don't.
It perfectly ties in with this concept that I talked about earlier of the evolving vision that we have of Norse culture. And what I think this comment made me realize is that to a large degree, our changing perception of Norse culture is effectively rooted in using other cultures as an analog or as an inspiration that we sort of project their aspects onto the Norse. If you look at how the Norse were represented in the 19th century, they were very much Romanized and Hellenized in a fundamental sense, in the sense that we projected the qualities of the Greco-Roman pantheon and culture onto Norse mythology. Jackson Crawford also talked about how there was an attempt to sort of make Loki into a god of, a material god of fire, a god of this, a god of that. And Jackson Crawford talks about in his videos about how, unlike Greek and Roman gods, Norse gods were not necessarily tied to an element. They were basically just characters, they were personality. What this commentator has aptly realized is that now our modern perception of the Norse is basically rooted in shamanizing them, in Mongolifying them, and Native Americanizing them. We have taken the attributes of Native American cultures, Mongolian cultures, and projected them onto the Norse. Again, I think due to the fact that in large part the audience and the people behind the whole Wardruna thing tend to be of a Wiccan, New Age, Neopagan, heathen kind of background, and those people, for the aforementioned reasons that I explained before, this sort of rejection of superficial aspects of that they associate with Christianity, basically fell in love with, shamanistic aspects in those other cultures, and so decided to subconsciously or consciously retroactively project them onto the Norse. However, to get to the point about the doing doing instrument, I just forgot the name, the jaw harp. No, the jaw harp actually was part of the Norse palette of instruments. It is not something that is due to that effect. Even though the jaw harp is very much something that you find in the Tuvan tradition and the Mongolian, etc. tradition, no, the Norse did have it. We believe it originated somewhere in China, and it had already made its way to Scandinavia and much of Eurasia, really, by the time of the Viking Age. So that's a coincidence, basically. But no, they did have the jaw harp. But all the rest, the throat singing and everything, can basically be ascribed to this shamanization, as the commenter says, of the Norse. This is the last epic talking video that I'm going to make on the subject of Norse music. I'll probably make some more historical reconstructions based on the scientific method of Norse music, but this is pretty much going to be it in terms of talking about Norse music. I've said everything I had to say on the subject. I never really wanted to talk about Norse music in the first place. I was never interested in it in the first place. And yet, I started doing that because I'm possibly one of the only channels on YouTube that is dedicated to debunking historical untruths when it comes to historical music. My goal, ultimately, with the Epic Talking series would be to become the Metatron of historical music, or the Lindy Beige of historical music. You have these channels that whenever a big piece of media that's super inaccurate comes out, they're here to point out the inaccuracies. And there's really no entity in the modern day and age more surrounded by historical untruth and misinformation than the modern Viking genre of music when it comes to historical music. When it comes to misconceptions about historical music, this is the one. This is the big final boss of the modern day and age. I don't like making those videos necessarily because, again, I think a lot of people will take these videos as condemnation of the works of these artists, and it's not. From a purely artistic point of view, what these artists have brought us is amazing music whilst remaining transparent about the nature of their job and never claiming that they were reconstructing Viking music or Norse music. And yet, the problem is the infinite stupidity of the masses and the infinite laziness, rather, I should say, of the masses is enormous. So the final thoughts that I have on this genre of music is that from a purely artistic point of view, it has been nothing but positive. It has brought us a new kind of sound that we've never had before. It has done the musical equivalent of Tolkien creating Middle-earth. They've created a new sound that never existed before. But from the angle of the pursuit of knowledge, of reality, of wanting truth to be preserved, this genre of music has been nothing but negative, nothing but destructive. It has had nothing but negative results when it comes to an accurate understanding of Norse culture, especially from the stance of music. Again, it's not their fault. And a problem that I have when it comes to media like this is that you always have apologists who put their hands in their fingers and go, la, 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 there's no problem with them. Whenever I try to talk about 300, and I say that 300 has been extremely problematic for the modern society in the way that it has shaped our vision of the Spartans and more near and dear to my heart, the ancient Iranians. And a lot of people love to go and la, 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 and they tell me there's no problem with 300. Everybody knows it's just supposed to be a comic book movie that's fantastical. No. That is literally not true, and those people are full of shit, because I know as an Iranian, ever since 300 came out, I constantly have to prove to people fighting an uphill battle, I have to prove to them, no, the ancient Achaemenid Empire was not some monstrous Mordor Uruk-hai fucking force of disgusting orcs and trolls and disfigured people nailing entire villages to trees. But that is the expectation that millions of people have because of 300. And I dislike this attitude that a lot of fans of media have of saying, I like this media, therefore I want to close myself off to the reality that it has had negative effects on an empirical level, on a knowledge level. And I dislike the delusion that a lot of people go through where they put their heads in the sand and want to deny that a piece of media that they enjoy, that is good artistically, has had negative effects truthfully, in terms of knowledge, in terms of understanding, in terms of pop culture. That is the case with 300. It's a great movie. I get that it has great artistry. I absolutely adore the cinematography and everything. However, I would like people to stop telling me that 300 was not fucking problematic for the modern day and age, because most people nowadays have a certain vision of the Spartans and have a certain vision of the ancient Iranian empires that is directly due to 300. And similarly, the same can be said for Wardruna and Heilung. But by far the worst aspect is the cultural appropriation that's happened. Again, I don't think those bands culturally appropriated elements like the Toggle Harpa, which is not Scandinavian. They did not culturally appropriate throat singing, which is not Scandinavian. But the collective stupidity of the masses in failing to understand that these forms of music are a modern take on spirituality that utilizes elements from different cultures and instead believed it to be an actual representation of Scandinavian historical music ended up doing that cultural appropriation. The Toggle Harpa was culturally appropriated through unwilling stupidity. Throat singing was culturally appropriated through unwilling stupidity. Millions upon millions of people, the vast majority of people who know about the existence of the Toggle Harpa, know about it in the false context of it being a Scandinavian Nordic folk instrument. Like this guy who posts videos saying this is an ancient Nordic instrument, and when people tried correcting him saying it's not an ancient instrument, you have some fucking clowns going, yeah, learn, wise up, man, it is a Scandinavian instrument. Of course, they're not offering any arguments. They're literally just saying that because they saw Einar Selvik play it, or whatever Wardruna band played it, and so they think that it's Scandinavian, and the maker of that video loved that comment. The maker of that video could have done 5 minutes of research and learned that it is not a Scandinavian instrument. How do you think it would feel to be a Toggle Harpa player from the Baltic region, from the Finnic region, somebody who has handed down this instrument from his grandmother's 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 grandmother's, generations upon generations of people from that culture playing this element of their cultural heritage, only for it to be now completely snatched away from them, so that in the collective consciousness of millions, the vast majority of people around the world, this has now been completely snatched away from its original cultural heritage and is now being credited as being something that the Vikings played, even though the ancient Norse of the Middle Ages never once played that instrument. There's not a single evidence or source for that. How do you think it would feel for the people for whom throat singing is a part of their cultural heritage, and now it's being snatched away from them, and there's people who have the gall to say not only did the Norse also have throat singing, it's the Mongols who stole throat singing from us. I have comments like these. These are the textbook definition of cultural appropriation, and this is not a fucking joke. I do not take cultural appropriation lightly. And the funniest thing is, those fanboys who are like, why does it matter who got throat singing from whom? It matters for the same reason that Cleopatra was not black, which is funny because when Netflix makes a black Cleopatra, people lose their shit, as they should. I lost my shit. I was against that. But the moment people start saying that the Norse had things that they didn't, that doesn't matter suddenly. When we start appropriating for the Norse elements that they never had in their cultural heritage and start retroactively claiming it as cultural heritage for the Scandinavians, which is what happened with the Toggle Harpa, which is what happened with throat singing, suddenly there's no problem with this. The hypocrisy is off the roof. These bands have had the unintended secondary effect of causing one of the biggest, most blatant, and most devastating forms of cultural appropriation that I can think of in the modern day and age. Cultural elements that are of the cultural heritage of lands foreign to Scandinavia have now been utterly and completely appropriated by them, not through the malice of any one entity, but through our collective stupidity as a culture. They are great from an artistic point of view, but they have fundamentally disfigured modern society's understanding of Norse music. Rather, they haven't disfigured it, they have created a chain of events that caused that disfigurement. I would not blame those bands themselves. Rather, I would compare them to Oppenheimer, where Oppenheimer did not mean to do harm by creating the nuclear weapon, but he did create a chain of events that ultimately led to that. I know what it feels like, believe me. Recently, Belisarius, one of my most well-known songs, has blown up on TikTok. The problem is, some dimwits decided to pass this off as an ancient Christian chant. Like, this is an actual Christian chant that survived the ages, and they're passing it off as this now. And you go on TikTok and you have millions upon millions of people going, "Oh, Jesus, I love Christianity." And it's like, it's not even about Christianity. I mean, sure, Belisarius was a Christian, the Eastern Roman Empire were Christians, but like, it's not about Christianity. And there are now hundreds of thousands of people who are starting to believe my work, Belisarius, to be an ancient Christian chant, disfiguring its very nature and misunderstanding its very nature and passing it off as that. What Belisarius is nothing more than a modern song written by a modern composer in the style of modern Greek folk music. It's a ballad with the theme of Belisarius, and what I'm afraid of is the power of the internet. The internet has the power to take something you did, ignore the reasons you've explained why you've done it, and then start propagating it on platforms that you don't have, that you're not on, that you have no chance of controlling, and passing it off as something that it is not. That's how misinformation is born. The internet has an extreme capacity for misinformation, and I believe that's what's being done with the work of Wardruna and Heilung. Einar Selvig wanted to create a new sound for a new religious movement, a modern musical interpretation of modern spirituality, using different inspirations from all over the world. And people took that away from him and started passing it off as, this is literally the music of the Norse. And I feel for him, because Einar Selvig and Heilung and all those bands deserve better. They deserve that we appreciate their work for their intended purposes.
Heilung. Do you remember when I said that the masses are stupid, and they will think our music is literal Norse music, and they will fail to see the genius of our work, that of a modern interpretation of spirituality?
Ja, I remember.
I believe it ended up happening.
How did Scandinavia end up with throat singing? Yes, the Norse had throat singing, and you're just a woke fucking loser. Throat singing is literally the most common form of singing across the planet, and for all we know, it's the Mongols who stole it from white people. Lamal buddy, literally everyone knows the Norse created throat singing, and the Mongols adopted it when they came into contact with Europe. I'm sorry, but throat singing belongs to us, Europeans.